Good afternoon, everyone. We are once again so glad you're here. I introduced myself earlier to a few of you. My name is Elizabeth Benton. I'm a longtime Maryland resident, just about 5 miles up the road here. This is my second Principals First and my second time as a volunteer, which is very rewarding, by the way. It is my honor to introduce the next group of presenters who really need no introduction. Mr. Steve Hayes is the editor and CEO of The Dispatch, an online magazine based out of Annapolis, Maryland, that covers a range of topics and shares crucial information and thought-provoking and studied opinions with a touch of humor. Mr. Jonah Goldberg is also editor-in-chief and co-founder of The Dispatch, and Mr. Michael Warren, also with The Dispatch, is a senior editor. Please join me in welcoming our panel of distinguished guests.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everybody. I was here yesterday. These are newbies. Jonah's responsible for the touch of humor at The Dispatch that she just mentioned, so we're expecting him to be very funny today as we talk about things that are really hilarious these days. Let me start in the news. I already thanked you all for being here yesterday. I'm going to just jump right in. So I watched this morning an interview with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and Shannon Bream, our old colleague Shannon Bream. And Hegseth was asked a few questions about Ukraine. And the back and forth was, if I'm summarizing, sort of, is it the case that Russia invaded Ukraine? Can't you just say that Russia invaded Ukraine? And Hegseth gave sort of a series of kind of dodging answers and ended by saying, this is all very complicated. So my question to you first, Jonah, is this very complicated?
Well, first of all, thanks you all for having me here. I was really kind of hoping I'd be on a panel with somebody else, but why
would he incite Mike Warren like that? I mean,
well, Mike's fine. Yeah, so like, this is, there's this great passage from Confucius where he talks about how society, when names stop being descriptors of reality, society goes crazy. And that's why he calls for the rectification of the names. And the simple, let's put it this way. The real gaslighting that is going on isn't about, this or that discrete issue or whether or not a hurricane was going to hit Alabama or whatever the outrage du jour things that Trump says, right? Or whether or not Zelensky's poll numbers are low. All of those lies matter and they bother me. And and if you had told me 30 years ago that I would be one of these dudes wagging his finger about the importance of truth, I would have been really offended. Not because I'm against truth 30 years ago, but just because I wasn't one of those finger waggy kind of types. I was the kind of guy that would want to smash your guitar against the Delta House wall. And now, like, I think truth is like the most important thing, but the real gaslighting that's going on now isn't about any discrete lie. It's about the idea itself that any of this is complicated. That, look, Washington and politics right now, it makes no sense. It's like a wacky Japanese game show. They must know behind the scenes what they're doing. There has to be some sort of master plan. Like even a lot of Trump's opponents and critics, somehow deep down, because they want to impose order on a chaotic world, sometimes, he's got a master plan, he's up to something, and it's really complicated, and here's my 3-point theory about what it is. And the reality is that for 90% of this stuff, it's really base lizard brain crap. It is just, like my friend Eli Lake makes this really important point that there's a difference between lying and bullshit. Because lying is kind of a sign of respect to the truth. The liar knows what the truth is and is denying it in a very specific way. The bullshitter just doesn't care whether something is true or false. It is just, you will throw out half-truths, whole truths, partial truths, this truth, that truth, or whole lies or any other flavor just to make people feel like nothing, that the truth is just an afterthought, right? Just to get what you want. That's the MO of this administration, basically. It is looking for loyalists. It is looking to have its way about everything. Trump has very basic sort of mob boss attitudes about foreign policy, and it's sort of like that scene in the Blues Brothers, what kind of music do you play here? Well, we got both kinds, country and Western, right? He's got a sort of a mob boss attitude towards politics and sort of international affairs and domestic affairs. And other than that, not much else. And, or I guess also business. So, but the desire to say it's complicated, right? You get these guys on all the Sunday shows talking about how what's very complicated about whether or not who started this war, right? And it's not complicated. It's not complicated how those babies died in Gaza. It's just very straightforward, and it takes a modicum of political courage just to tell the truth, even when it's inconvenient to your own side. And that is what is so profoundly lacking these days.
Mike, Jonah quoted Confucius and the Blues Brothers in his answer. Can you compete with that?
I'm not even going to try. By the way, I was promised I would get a chainsaw when I came up here, and there's no chainsaw. Principles first, fine, but you missed that part of the writer. Look, I think the complicated sort of parry, which is really what that is, right? It's a parry to the very simple question: is who invaded whom? It is an indication to me that Pete Hegseth in this case, but you can sort of look at it from any Trump administration figure or a Trump apologist in the media, an activist or whatever. It's a sort of admission that an implicit admission that they know they're kind of bullshitting. It's a way of avoiding the very simple answer, right? It's a way to say, well, I can't actually tell you what the real truth is, what is obvious, what we know is the truth, because that makes things very complicated for me. So I have to now say that it is complicated. Look, I think that we're in a situation where people have completely. They're sort of over a barrel about the new administration. They don't really know what to do. The only thing that they sort of know how to deal with this, right? There was, let me back up. In the first Trump administration, there was this kind of sense of, okay, like we've got to maybe keep this guy on the rails, keep him from doing things that he doesn't even know are dangerous, things that he doesn't even know are that he shouldn't be doing as president. And I think there's a kind of sense in this new world that, look, fear is kind of at work here. And like, we've just got to fall in line. We've just got to kind of bullshit through this. And so you end up with situations like what Hegseth said today. And it's unfortunate, it's dispiriting, and I like to think, not to make this a advertisement for the Dispatch, but I like to think that
you can do that.
Sure.
Go
okay.
ahead.
That's what a publication like ours kind of exists to do. It's one of the reasons I'm very proud to work there is to kind of just say, like, it doesn't, like, we don't have to like make things more complicated in order to please somebody or some movement or something like that. We can just tell you that it's very simple, actually, that Russia did invade Ukraine, and leave it at that. So I can't think of a movie to reference it.
Does, I hadn't really thought about this before, but no one has sort of pointed out that, like, one of the useful mental techniques in this era is to take people as if they actually mean what they're saying.
Yeah.
And we're so used to assuming that they're just lying and spinning to sort of like get out of these situations, these deer in the headlight moments, that they can't actually mean it. But like, it's worth pointing out, let's just say for the sake of argument that Pete Hegseth actually believes it's complicated. Well, how does that influence the foreign policy craftsmanship that we're going to have going forward, right? Like, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Marco Rubio honestly believes that Donald Trump is the greatest deal maker in the history of humanity, and only he could fix these complex geopolitical situations. Like, how does the policy process, what does the policy process look like among a bunch of people who actually believe those things are true? And that, in some ways, would be scarier to me than if they're all just trying to cover their asses and say what the boss wants to hear.
So here's a question that occurs to me, and I'll preface it by a story that probably some of you who are dispatch members, and I've talked to many dispatch members here, have heard before. But so I was at the Donald Trump event when he went after John McCain. This was in Ames, Iowa in 2015, and we've all seen the clips. We all know what happened. He was being interviewed on a stage by Frank Luntz. He was one of, I think, 12, 13, 14 Republican presidential wannabes being interviewed by McCain. I was there. This was the summer of 2015. I was there to cover everybody else and not really paying attention to Donald Trump. I didn't think he was likely to catch fire and to be the Republican nominee. And in this appearance, Frank Luntz asks him about John McCain, and Trump goes on and says, I prefer soldiers who weren't captured, and basically blames John McCain for his own capture. A number of sort of crazy insults. And I went down, I was in the balcony, I went downstairs, and they had a little press conference with Trump after this moment. And there were, I don't know, probably a dozen of us. There's video of this somewhere. There were a dozen of us. And I looked at Trump and I asked him a question, and I was losing my cool. I did not sort of keep it together. I was pissed. I thought it was ridiculous that he had said what he had said. And, if I had to do it again, I would have been maybe been a little bit more even. But I was pissed. I was insulted by it. And so I confronted him, and I'm reading his quotes from my notebook, and I'm looking at my notebook. And my job for the past 30 years is to take pretty good notes on what people say. I'm pretty good at it. So I was reading exact quotes. Trump, how could you say that you prefer soldiers who aren't captured? How could you suggest that John McCain, was somehow an inferior soldier because he spent time as a POW? And Trump looked right back at me and just denied that he had said what he had just said. He said, I didn't say that. And I read him the quote again, and he denied it again. And I read him the quote again, and he said, no. I was just criticizing John McCain's position on veterans issues. And you do have this moment, or at least I had this moment, where you stop and you think, did I totally screw this up? Did I just misunderstand what this guy's doing? Because, at that point, I'd been covering politics for 20 years, and I was so unaccustomed to somebody lying that aggressively, that obviously. It was on video. There were 1,500 of us in the auditorium. And he just denied what he had just said. And my question to you, obviously my view is that this is not new. Trump did this a lot. I remember also, I'll end with a second brief story, working with Bret Baier on some questions. Bret had a big interview with Trump coming up on Fox News when I was still at Fox News, and Bret and I sometimes worked together on questions. And this was sort of at the tail end of the Donald Trump-driven narrative that Rafael Cruz had been involved in the JFK assassination. And this had gone on for 2 weeks, and it was all made up, and we later found out from court documents that the National Enquirer was in on this, and it was, the whole thing was a setup. But I'm working on these questions with Bret, and on the one hand, in a normal news cycle with a normal politician, we probably would have concluded, this story has run its course. There's not really much utility in asking about this anymore. It had been thoroughly debunked. There wasn't anything. But as we worked on the questions, I said, I think it's really important that you ask him once again, even though this has been thoroughly debunked, especially because this has been thoroughly debunked. Ask him once again, do you think that Rafael Cruz was involved in the JFK assassination? And Bret, to his great credit, asked Trump once again. The story had gone away. The story had basically died. And Trump, of course, said, yeah, I'm paraphrasing, but more or less, yeah, I think he was. And this was reported in the National Enquirer. And the National Enquirer should win a Pulitzer Prize for all of its great reporting. Remember, the National Enquirer had John Edwards, and they were probably right about this too. It just does this whole thing where there's not even a moment where he stops and says, like, is this true? Can people check me on it? And it's how I think he can say things like, Volodymyr Zelensky is responsible for starting the war, and Russia's not the aggressor. So my question to you guys is, has this gotten somehow worse? I mean, I do think you see people like Pete Hegseth, you see Markwayne Mullin, senator from Oklahoma today, having trouble answering these very basic questions of, reality, truth, and falsity. Are more people willing to lie on Trump's behalf today than before? And have we gotten to the point where perception matters as much as reality in some cases? They can sort of create this alternative reality. And that's what the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, uses to make his decisions. Have we reached this point where perception matters as much as reality? Mike?
I think we have, and I don't like saying that because I like to be an optimistic person, but I think we're at a moment where it is just patently obvious that there are decisions being made, that we have sort of an administration that is sort of run on. I mean, go back to the campaign. I mean, go back to this most recent campaign where we had, what was that, weeks of kind of debate about whether immigrants were eating cats in Springfield, Ohio. I mean, that's a great example where it didn't really matter whether it was true. It didn't really matter whether whether the mayor of Springfield was trying to talk about, hey, we actually welcome, these migrants here because they've done good things for our community. What was important was the bigger point, that immigration was out of control and that the Biden administration had been too, permissive on these sorts of things. I mean, the actual facts on the ground should have mattered.
And J.D. Vance at one point almost acknowledged this, right?
Yes.
Basically says look, it helped us. It helped us make this bigger political point. I mean, conservatives used to be the people who objected to fake but accurate. That's what Dan Rather did, right? That's how he rationalized. He used forged documents to make an argument on 60 Minutes that weren't true. Used to care about that. Jonah?
Yeah, so I've talked and written about this a bunch. I deserve some small portion of the blame for the American rights obsession with Saul Alinsky. I was one of the first guys to write about the problem with Alinskyites, and my first book, I talked about how Hillary Clinton was sort of
Can you just give us a
So Saul Alinsky was a very effective community organizer, right? Remember that phrase, how big that was? Who basically believed in sort of say whatever you need to say, demonize whoever you need to demonize in order to win your fight. And he was a influence on Barack Obama, his influence on Hillary Clinton. I probably emphasized it too much. I did, but I said, I argued that one of the problems with the left is how much they've internalized this Alinskyite stuff. And I watched it happen in real time, where I said Alinsky was bad. I pointed out that one of the dedications in Rules for Radicals, which is his most famous book, is to Lucifer, which, I thought was kind of a tell. And
Jonah, that's complicated.
I watched in real time as the right went from saying, the left always wins because they're Alinskyites, to we have to be Alinskyites too. And I'm not saying that like J.D. Vance has studied Alinsky or anything like that, but Dinesh D'Souza's pushed this argument, all these kind of people push this argument, and you can watch in real time over the last 15 years or so that the right went from criticizing the left for its abuses of power and truth to saying the only way we can beat the left is to do the exact same thing. And now lying and twisting and distorting has become sort of a feature, not a bug, and you see it all over the place. And I think this sort of raises a larger concern for me, which is that, when you were talking about the first term, Trump was, he had a lot of flawed people in his administration, but he also had a lot of people who had lines, right, that they would not cross. And Mike Pence is the most famous example of that. He waited till pretty close to the end to have a line he would not cross, but he wouldn't cross it, and he's paid a significant price, for that, and he should be, congratulated for that. We're now seeing, not just at the cabinet level and at the sub-cabinet level, but in the rank and file level, the kids at CPAC level, this view that says this approach is normal. That this isn't like what you have to do in extremis, or like this is a regrettable last resort, that this is just actually politics now. And it reminds me, so Edmund Burke he gave a very famous speech called the Birds of Prey speech, where he was talking about how, and it marks a really important milestone in the history of sort of understanding foreign policy and colonialism and all sorts of things along those lines, because he makes this argument that the young officers who are there as part of the British East India Company, right, in India, they're doing bad things to the Indians, and he condemned that. But he also said they're internalizing the idea that this is a fine thing to do. And then they're coming back to England with this distorted and deformed understanding of what decency and political decency is about, and it's corrupting us here at home. And I still talk to a lot of young people, and the number of young people who think that this is how that Matt Gaetz is the person you want to emulate, right? That this is how you do politics is very depressing to me. And it's not, I understand focusing on Trump, but Trump is a 78-year-old dude. At minimum, the actuarial tables will eventually be right. But we've got a whole generation of people who, they are now invested in the idea that this is how you do politics, this is how you think about politics. It's a lot about glory and almost nothing about honor and or virtue. And you can see that in how we're treating Ukraine and the defenses of it and this outrageous extortion that Trump is trying to impose on Ukraine, which is fundamentally dishonorable. You can see it in the defenses of how we're talking about treating our NATO allies and thinking it's for suckers to actually care about your word and your integrity on the international stage. And you can see it in sort of the day-to-day petty little Twitter BS that is all over the place. And that toxin is going to take a long time to work out of the system.
Mike, let me pick up on that and ask you about the conservative movement. You've been reporting, writing about, sort of, I would argue, a part of the conservative movement for many years. The stuff you're doing for us these days, I think, sort of really looks at some of gets into the cracks of the conservative movement, touches the raw stuff that should be touched. What should we think about the conservative movement? Is there a conservative movement anymore? Has the conservative movement been just totally overtaken and overwhelmed by the MAGA movement? What happened to sort of Reagan-style conservatives or classical liberals, people believe in limited government?
There are dozens of us.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say
many of them in this room.
I was going to say in this room is probably, when you're talking about the extent of that conservative movement, it might not be much bigger than who is in here. Look, a lot of I believe that there still exists might call it a remnant, a rump of people, even here in D.C., who are trying to sort of hold on to that. But I do think the conservative movement has been co-opted or subsumed by MAGA, and for all intents and purposes, MAGA is what the conservative movement is now, because I think that's how you can look at, and you can complain about this, but you can look at any mainstream media coverage of it, and the phrase conservative movement or conservative activists, I mean, it has become synonymous with MAGA activists and the MAGA movement, and perception is reality in that sense. I think it's important, though, for certainly someone like me who's like reporting on this and is sort of trying to hold subjects' feet to the fire on certain principles that they may have said or proclaimed, just to point out the cognitive dissonance or the separation from actions and words to maybe actions and words that folks have taken in the past. But I think, look, I've written a lot about the Heritage Foundation. To me, it's a great example of the co-opting of the conservative movement. This is a think tank that was created back in 1973, I believe, as a sort of antidote to Nixonian republicanism, as a way to say, can we inject some kind of conservative ideas into into governance, but particularly in reaction to Richard Nixon and wage and price controls and the sort of expansion of the welfare state. And I think that's a noble goal, and it's something that that Heritage did well for a long time. I just think it's a tragedy and a preventable tragedy that this institution of kind of the conservative movement has completely been taken over, has willingly allowed itself to be taken over by a populist movement that on so many things it is distinctly unconservative. But when the number one conservative think tank in Washington that's thought of as kind of conservative, when it becomes taken over by MAGA, then I do think we get into a sort of situation where, well, that is what the conservative movement looks like now. But look, there's always going to be people who sort of hold that kind of Reaganite flame. I like to think that we sort of we try to do that at the Dispatch as much as we can through our reporting and analysis, and things cycle through things, but there will be MAGA mistakes, and maybe it will revive again, but maybe not in my lifetime.
So I think look, I spend a lot of my day cutting myself, so don't get me wrong, but I'm a little more upbeat than that. I think there are an enormous number of people who really wish it didn't have to be this way, and
many of them are elected Republicans.
Many of them are elected. Fewer than there were in 2016. I mean, I used to call the closet normals the biggest block on the Republican side. That's not the case anymore. Now they are much more of a remnant. But that said, there are a lot of people in our line of work. I don't want to get into a name thing, but who really wanted a DeSantis, a Nikki, somebody else to be the nominee, but then the fundamental thing that distorts so much of our politics is the need to be anti-left. And so long as Trump can drink those tears, then the sort of tribal logic kicks in, and a lot of people are going to fall in line. And don't get me wrong, we could talk about policy things where I think Trump is more on the right side than the wrong side, or at least the rhetoric uses and all that kind of stuff. But that's all sort of, at this point, kind of secondary or tertiary. The simple point is that, for those of you who listen to The Remnant, you've heard me talk about this a million times. My wife had my favorite New Yorker cartoon blown up and framed for me. And it's got two dogs drinking martinis in suits in Manhattan. And one dog says to the other, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail. And the thing that puts asses in the seats for Republican politics these days is the cats must fail stuff. And that's what causes a lot of people to seem more MAGA than they actually are. And I think a post-Trump GOP is going to be a hot mess. but it is not going to be nearly as MAGA as a lot of the MAGA people think it's going to be. I think it's going to be more like an open civil war. I don't think every other pundit seems to disagree with me on this. I don't think Vance has this obvious clear shot to be the next president of the United States.
I'm with you.
It's going to be contested, and that's one of the reasons why you have to guard against losing your freaking mind, which is really just the easiest path to take. It's sort of like Jesus take the wheel, and that's where you'll end up, right? And I get it, but at the same time, democracy is about arguments. The conservative movement is historically about arguments, and there are arguments that we're going to need to make in the future, and you need to have credibility. You need to have not sort of just gone into full derangement about this stuff, pro or anti, and make the arguments and stay focused on the facts, because that's what's going to win in the long run, because that's what always wins in the long run.
So back to you on this question. I'm going to set aside the temptation to talk about Jonah losing his own mind for a minute and ask you an actual question. When you look at what Trump is doing these days, if you just take it, if you take the policies at face value, you look at what he's doing, like, he's hardly conservative in any way that we would understand it. I mean, look at his labor secretary nominee. Look at Tulsi Gabbard, who's pro-Snowden, who's, pro-Syria, who's pro-Russia. You can go sort of downline. Yeah, RFK Jr. I mean, I think one of the most fascinating moments in the past decade of our politics was Ted Cruz's enthusiastic endorsement of the guy who thought Obamacare didn't go far enough. He's for single payer. RFK Jr. is for single payer. Ted Cruz brought the U.S. Congress and the entire U.S. government to a halt in 2013 with a 21-hour filibuster because Obamacare was way too far. And now he's for the guy who thinks Obamacare didn't go far enough. So much of the stuff that we're seeing isn't conservative in any identifiable way. And there's a real question about whether, is the Republican Party a limited government party in any appreciable way?
I think the Republican Party... It's all right. Someone's phone got away from them. I think there are lots of people in the Republican Party who believe they are limited government. That's part of the reason why they like this DOJ stuff. They're looking at it from a very flattering angle, but they're convincing themselves that it's part of the limited government argument, and there's something to that there. But at the end of the day, look, I hate talking about pieces I haven't written yet, but our new ideas editor, Valerie, she asked me to write about this, is there a distinction between right-wing and conservative now? And I'm working on that now, and I've been thinking about that for a while before she even asked, and there really is, right? I mean, right-wing to a certain extent just codes as populism. And it's funny, I've been writing against populism for 30 years, and I can send you the links to the things. And for the first 20 years of that just made me part of the sort of a very established intellectual wing of conservatism. Now it makes me a rhino cuck sellout who just doesn't know what time it is or whatever. And but populism historically is fundamentally a left-wing thing. It's about grievance politics. It's inherently anti-intellectual, and it basically says the state must satisfy my needs, heedless of the arguments, heedless of the costs. And it generally gets bound up in cults of personality, and but it can be right-wing in terms of its cultural sentiments, in terms of its attitudes about various things, in terms of its, the left wing can be very mean and the right wing can be very mean, but there's a difference between the meanness, right? And so I think that the Republican Party has been a flawed vehicle for limited government for a long time. I was the guy who thought compassionate conservatism was a problem. But now I think it's essentially a cult of personality more than anything else. And it doesn't mean everybody has given up their limited government pretensions. They're just perfectly willing to put them on a very high shelf and visit them later, as they just basically say, whatever the big guy says is right, I trust him.
Mike, is the Republican Party a limited government party today?
No, and I think all of what's happening with Doge, Elon Musk, kind of just taking a scythe to the federal government is actually hurting the case for limited government in the long run because it's indiscriminate. Look, I am neighbors with people who work for the federal government who can tell you there are people who work with them that need to be fired.
But the people who need to be fired aren't the ones taking the buyouts.
That's right. That's right. So look, I mean, the whole process is exactly the wrong way you would go about this, and we haven't talked about process either, but. We are supposed to be a nation of laws and of the Constitution, and money that has been appropriated by Congress needs to be spent because that is what the Constitution requires. The executive branch's job is not to just cut things that they don't like. It's to execute what Congress has appropriated and ask them to pass laws to have the executive branch execute. So I think it's not only not a vessel for limited government, it's not really a vessel for constitutional government either. That's been a problem, frankly, it was a problem before Trump. It's a problem that's not just with the Republican Party. I think it's a huge problem with the Democratic Party, but these things sort of get stacked on top of each other, and everybody kind of says, well, they did it. It's reminds me of when my kids, are like, well, don't get mad at me because my brother did it too. And everybody just ends up doing it worse than the last guy. So the long and short of it is no.
Oh, that's depressing.
Sorry.
Well, we're going to wrap it up there. I want to thank Heath for having us. Thank you all for your attention. And I've had a good time talking to many dispatch members here yesterday and today. If you are not a member of the dispatch or you're interested in what we're doing, go to thedispatch.com. Check us out. You can sign up for free. And thanks again for having us. Appreciate it.